GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International Spotlight is on an 1109 carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Danielle Park. She's the editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite. She's also the president of Venable Park Investment Council Incorporated. Best of the season, Danielle?
Yes, you too, Jim.
You're kind of worried, or are you, about the kind of cabinet Trump is putting in and the kind of policies he's already espousing via Twitter?
Wow. I think every thinking person is sort of aghast at what's going on there. I think, first of all, I would like to just say that I think there's a brashness, a lack of civility around what Trump is doing that is taking people by surprise. It's shocking to watch someone so unabashedly self-interested, apparently unable to have any balance in what they do. His appointments really reflect a very heavy pro-oil, pro-big corp kind of mandate, and I think it's a little ironic because, first of all, because he was elected by the so-called working class to help clean the swamp or, drain all this corporatocracy that was oppressing workers and keeping wages flat for the last 20 years in real terms. So he seems to be, delivering the antithesis of what he promised. But I also think this lack of civility is perhaps a cathartic event because for the last, say, 20 years, whatever party has been in charge in most governments in the world, certainly let's say in the United States as an example, whether it's been Democratic or conservative, I think the Democrats have tried to put more sort of softness around the edges of their service to corporations and big oil and that sort of thing, big food, big finance. Those have really been the arms that have been driving the government from, almost like a puppet, driving the politicians like puppets on the knee of these corporations. And I think that, there was a sort of a window dressing around it when other governments have been in, and not as overtly, unashamed. And I think that's what's different about Trump. I think that because he came in on the mandate he did, it's shocking many people because he seems to be doing the antithesis of what he promised. But secondly, I think it's because he's not nice. He's not civil. He doesn't pretend to be. He brings out the worst sort of attributes that one could imagine for a leader in a civilized democracy. And I think for that reason, it's shocking everyone. But perhaps it'll be cathartic in the end because I think this will truly bring us to a breaking point. There's talk about whether the Electoral College wants to endorse him for his position, and whether there's 40 people have apparently signed a petition saying they want further briefing on potential ties to Russia or rigging of election results or tapping in from other foreign interests. And so there's some discussion about whether the Electoral College would actually have the nerve to not endorse this candidate. I actually don't think that will happen, and a part of me doesn't want that to happen. As scary and as caveman-like in many ways as his policies and picks are. I think that would be a mistake at this point if he was thwarted in his taking on the role, because I think then forevermore you will have him empowered and, saying that if he'd had the chance, he would have fixed everything, and I think his followers would never be, appeased because they would feel that their candidate, won the election and should have been endorsed. So I think in this way we have to kind of let this thing, or I think we have to watch this thing unfold with horror and trepidation, of course, but at the same time with hope that the system has checks and balances that will refrain him from the most damaging possibilities of what he's going to do, but also because I think it may finally just smash the apathy and the tolerance for this big business driving the bus. He's really making no bones about it. And billionaire class really do have a different set of values, a set of perceptions about the world, sense of relative, costs and relative incomes. They're really skewed in the sense that, there's a club of about 1,000 worldwide, and most of them are taking positions in Trump's government. So I really think this might be a final breaking point in this system that's really been rigged and broken for a long time. And so in a way, I know change tends to be messy and ugly, real change, and this is why I'm encouraged. I know this is messy and ugly and scary, but within 2 years you have the midterm elections, and he could lose seats or endorsement from people in the midterm election if he hasn't delivered on all the big promises. And I think the chances of any government delivering quickly on promises to reignite the economy would have been, very unlikely to be fulfilled. So whoever had won the election, the promises would be very difficult to deliver on, especially in short term, because what needs to be done now is not more short-term stimulus of consumer spending on credit, which has been the go-to for 30 years. What needs to happen now is to have more intelligent investment, business investment, household savings, restoring financial stability. But, I don't know if you caught, there was an article, we've talked several times about the difficulties with pensions in the world, Jim, and especially recently with the Dallas police and firefighters pension. They had a run of large lump sum withdrawals because people are concerned that the pension is, 50% funded and it can't pay out the promises that it's made. The demographics are leaning against it in terms of too many people withdrawing versus too few young people contributing. But really this is, again, a poster child for what's going on in many pensions around the world, although the Dallas one is a more extreme example of it, but actually the math has been going this way in most pensions, and everyone's been kicking the can and pretending that they could make more than they are able to make in current conditions and yields. And I thought it was very telling this week. They reported that they were going to freeze withdrawal requests, which is, again, this whole notion of revelation that there is a liquidity problem and a solvency problem here. Solvency in the sense of they've written too many IOUs and don't have sufficient funds. And then also there was a story last week that they're looking to now go after the people who have already withdrawn lump sums of money. They do that in Ponzi schemes, if you remember. In the Madoff fiasco, for example, they went back, not only did the trustees seize the funds, but they went back to people who had cashed out money over the prior 20 years and started following up to take back those proceeds. So this is what happens at the end of Ponzi schemes, and that's why pensions have very often been run in that way for the past few years. Everyone kicking the can, everyone pretending that it was going to work out, and as the capital erodes so quickly, both because of demographics, because of low yields today, because we've been through boom bust in asset markets repeatedly over the last 15 years, the holes in the pot are just getting so hard to ignore that they're now starting to lay blame. And I think this will be the next phase of this, where people start looking at the board of directors, for example, and the financial advisors and the trustees and the people who have pretending and extending and giving the bad advice will start being sued by the beneficiaries, because once they realize there's not enough funds in the pot and that it's not going to be fixed and that they're starting to shut down withdrawals, then you get a real uprising from the people and awareness and snapping again out of the apathy that they've been in for the past several years. So I think that's all moving towards this theme of more personal accountability. Now, ironically, at the same time, you notice that the Trump government coming in has vowed to throw out the fiduciary standard rule. And we've talked about that many times too, Jim, where the fiduciary standard being the requirement of those giving retirement advice to people, trusting them, that they do what's in the best interest of the person looking for the advice and not in the best interest of the advisor and their company in terms of profits. So that was coming in April. It had been telegraphed for a couple of years. The industry's been making, changes away from commission and hidden fees and, product selling mandates toward more interest in what's the best advice for the client. And ironically, the trumpet men coming in saying we're going to throw that out. So I think this is, again, the most garish example of someone who promised to help the little guy, right, who promised that he was going to, quit making these sort of end these obscene benefits and abuses taken by financial types and by large corps. And indeed, he's doing the exact opposite, right? He's coming in as the most conflicted president of all time in history in terms of his own financial interests, in terms of crony capitalism, in terms of, as a salesman, just saying, why would anybody have to be held accountable? And the rationale for throwing out the fiduciary standard ruling is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is saying, well, they're urging immediate action to throw out this fiduciary rule because if it enacted, it'll just choke growth and lead to litigation against financial advisors. So it's like, oh yeah, we can't afford ethical, honest advice because it'll be hard on profits and it'll open the doors to more litigation. I mean, we're just in this farcical, crazy world where, ethics is thrown out. It's every person for themselves, and the people at the top are taking all the cream and leaving empty buckets for the rest. So I think that's what's been the forces of revolution in history, and I think that the more intense this gets, the more likely we'll finally have a breaking up of many of these cartels and a restart.
We'll have more with Danielle Park right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Danielle Park. Danielle, in Ontario, you have a horrible problem with super high hydro prices, people literally freezing in the dark. What is the long-range forecast for energy in Ontario, and do they feel bad that they don't have pipelines from Alberta bringing them cheaper energy?
Well, there's a classic example of thinking fast and slow, right? In terms of fast, the impetus is to, get more cheap energy to everyone in the country and to avoid having to pay foreigners for imports into the country, which is essentially what we're doing now in some places because we don't have, access to our own oil in places east of Alberta and that sort of thing. So there's definitely this urge, which I understand, which is, hey, we're wasting money that we could use in our own country by buying abroad because we don't have these pipelines. We need to build these pipelines and get access to cheap fuel. The problem with that, Jim, is it's a very short-sighted argument because ultimately what we really need is not to invest money in more infrastructure that is short-term window stuff where it'll provide, an access for an antiquated fuel for a few more years, when in fact the type of investment that we really need is in clean energy, green energy, renewable energy. So we're talking about the continental grids that we need to build so that people can upload all sorts of fuel to the grid. That will bring down the prices. That will lower household expenditures, increase disposable income, and be very invigorating for the economy. But it's not something that can happen instantly, right? So a longer-term investment thesis here is to do something that will increase productivity for the future. And I submit that just building more pipelines for short-term alleviation of this logjam is a very short-sighted and ultimately waste of public funds. And I know that's unpopular in places like Alberta, who have been in recession and are looking for ways to get back to the good old days of selling their product. But unfortunately, the world has fundamentally changed because of technology, because of the possibilities of all the various cheap energy around. That's why Bill Gates, for example, announced that he's starting a innovative energy fund with a bunch of his billionaire friends, and that they're looking at ways to create clean, cheap energy. And he points out that on a full cost accounting basis, so that's when you take into effect not just the price spent on the fuel, but the ancillary costs. So, for example, with oil, an ancillary cost is the degradation to the environment, the oil sands, the tailing pools, the wasted water, the energy expended just to get that fuel out of the earth. That kind of thing is all actually what should be added to your full cost accounting of what the price of that product is. And when you do that, innovation has actually made clean energy cheaper, and it can be directly accessible to households and businesses, but we need to do this upfront infrastructure investment. So it has to be done in America, which is why, Trump's comments are so Neanderthal and lack such understanding in terms of the big picture here. Rejecting this whole clean energy boom, which is global, which is the biggest growth boom in the world today, rejecting that because you don't believe that climate change is happening is neither here nor there, essentially, because first of all, it's a dumb response, but second of all, even if you don't believe in climate change, you should believe in increased productivity, because that's where all the benefits for a society, that's where true improvement in living standards come from, lowering expenses and getting more out of each effort you make in terms of whether it's working hours and whether it's expenditure for things like your living expenses. So, if you want to have a economy that's booming, that can afford to buy its own products, households and businesses that can afford to buy their own products and invest in their own country, this is just a no-brainer way to do that. But again, it's not a quick fix, and that's the trouble with politics today, right? You have a bunch of people sitting around wanting a sudden, quick treat, if you will, when actually the long-term investment story is the one that's going to improve things over time, and that requires, giving up some short-term spending and some short-term apparent gains in order to get that long-term payback.
You said civility is disappearing. I think the Chinese fired the first shot when it came to civility, when they told the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister to pretty well take a hike, a long hike off a short pier, when he asked them to pay more attention to human rights, when he just said it's none of your business. And the Foreign Affairs Minister from China attacked reporters who asked him about human rights. And is Trump taking a page out of their book?
Well, I think there's no question that we've come through a pendulum swing here where, as I said, there was a very thin varnish of civility, I think, because a lot of dark things have been going on in the world, and yet certain systems and leaders, sort of gave the perception that things were not as bad as they seem. I think that the gloves are off now. I think that, China has a terrible human rights record. America has a very bad civil rights record, and certainly with their prison systems today, using the mass incarceration to deal with drug problems, the racial dynamics of who's being arrested, shot, put in prison, all that stuff. There's a lot of that. I opined the other day, and it's occurred to me many times. Imagine how much further the world would be today if, after 9/11, America had not taken that terrorist bait and chased them back to the Middle East to do battle and pour hundreds of billions of dollars into their coffers of the bad guys over there, which emboldened ISIS and all sorts of terrorist fractions. What if, instead of doing that, which is what the terrorists wanted, right? That's that's the reason for terrorist acts, is that they're sitting over there with very little resources, and they come, do something in the West where there's more money, and they know that the resources will chase them back, and then they'll get to capture all sorts of benefit from that. So instead of doing all that, imagine if the Bush administration had said, hey, the way out of this is to break our reliance on foreign oil. The way to do that is to invest and spend all our money and issue debt, not to fight a war overseas, but rather to make ourselves energy efficient. Imagine how much different things would be today. It would be, I would argue that there wouldn't be the rise of all these very well-equipped and funded factions overseas, and that America would be that much further ahead. We wouldn't have all these, thousands and thousands of post-traumatic stress disorder soldiers walking around. They could have used the military for that. If they were looking for jobs for the military, no better thing for your national security than to make yourself self-sufficient and highly productive in your own economy. So anyway, I'm just saying that, I think it's true that the gloves are off and that a lot of world leaders are, we had the Brexit vote, we had the Italian vote, we've got the uprise of these parties all over the world, but I think it's very understandable in the context of what's been going on. There's real financial strife in the world. It has been earned by bad and reckless activities and choices, both on a, financial services sector giving people self-serving advice that actually hollowed out the middle class, and bankrupted pensions, short-termism, which meant consumption at the expense of long-term savings and investment. Instead of making yourself productive at home, allowing multinational companies to dictate the mandate and put your national security in the hands of foreign powers who are selling you things like oil. I think all of that has been going on for years, and this time, it's perhaps less pleasant and more upsetting because it is no civility. The veneer's been knocked off. But I think, as I said, perhaps the good news is that it's exposing these things for what they are, and that people will have a revulsion. The populace, not just politicians, but the populace will have a revulsion phase and say, we actually need a change. They didn't get a change with Trump. We'll see if they get a change in other countries, but I think that the patience is running out here, and this is how you end up finally getting a social shift. So let's hope that more good comes out of this in the end than bad that happens in the meantime.
Well, Justin Trudeau, of course, brought in all the Syrian refugees, and even though they have very few resources yet, because only, I think, 17% have found jobs, they threw a big party in Vancouver to thank Canada for welcoming them to the country. Now, that's the kind of attitude that probably goes a long way. When they tell their relatives back in the Middle East, Canada really welcomed us, and you should welcome those people. You should be friendly with them.
Well, I think, people that are good, honest, nonviolent, wanting to improve life for themselves, their family, and the planet exist all over the world. It's just that the bad guys have a lot of the control and the money. And so, I think we have to keep trying to reach out. Good people have to reach out. They have to take steps. They can't afford to sit back and be apathetic. I think that's part of how we got into the mess we're in today. People need to speak out. They have platforms now that were never available before, through the internet, for example. And so there's hope. And, I think it's naive to think that there aren't a lot of people in the world that are anti-Western values. And again, some of it justifiably. We have to look at what actions have been taken, especially by a country like America in the Middle East, to make so many enemies, not to justify terrorist factions and crazy behavior, but it's not as if they come to it with clean hands, right? There's fault all around here. And I think every one of us has to look at the choices and activities we've been doing, whether it be with managing our finances, whether it be with not being involved in our community, whether it be with the choice we've made on a health basis, to either improve or harm our own health, whether, all those choices have to come into play here. And I think that, again, going back to personal responsibility at all levels it's possible for us to improve, but only if we're prepared to make changes on a ground-up basis.
Now, Ottawa announced the rules or proposed rules for having marijuana sales in Canada. And excuse me for the voice here, I got a touch of the flu. But Colorado, with a population of just over 5 million, made $1 billion the past year in marijuana sales. Canada's population 6 times bigger. In fact, almost 7 times bigger. So we should make $6 to $7 billion on legal pot. Is that a positive? Because people are going to buy it anyway.
We need the revenue. And truthfully, we make a ton of tax on other legal drugs like caffeine and alcohol and, cigarettes, tobacco, all that. Those have been long-standing, drugs that the governments have all collected huge revenues from. If you talk to police force, they will tell you that, parties where people are consuming marijuana are in no way as volatile and violent and dangerous as parties they enter where people have consumed alcohol in large quantities, for example. So I think there's no justification to truly defend alcohol versus marijuana. And again, we need the revenue. So if that's going to be the case, let's admit the truth, which is that some people want to consume that as a recreational, sedative, essentially, and that's not going to go away. And so, I think, the less hypocritical we can be about things and the more we admit facts, the more likely we are to find solutions.
Right. I mean, former Prime Minister Harper saying that pot was worse than tobacco. Well, we know tobacco kills 1,200 people a day in Canada. Even fentanyl, as deadly as it is, isn't killing 1,200 people a day. How could he say that pot was worse than tobacco?
Well, I think that's a pretty typical conservative position. But again, I think we have so many real large issues that we need to work on that we really shouldn't spend a lot of energy, fighting against things that make a lot of sense. And the case for the harm to society is very difficult to make for marijuana, against marijuana in favor of alcohol. So I think, we just have to admit that and say, let's move on to things that really need solving.
Well, Washington and Colorado now have had legal pot for quite some time. And we live next door to Seattle. I haven't heard of any pot-driven riots or mass murders or anything like that. Well,
it's typically not the way that drug impacts the human brain. So again, on a social, danger spectrum, I don't think you can argue that marijuana is a risk.
Danielle, I know you're off on an extensive holiday now, and we thank you very much for all your help and work for us over the past year, and hope that the new year is happier, brighter for you, your family, and everybody else.
Thank you, Jim. I think, I wish you the very best and the listeners the very best as well. And I think, again, we shouldn't lose hope. We should just focus on local, grassroots steps we can make in our own families and our own communities. And I think all leadership comes from the ground up, not from the top down. So I think if we stick with that, we shouldn't feel futile or overwhelmed. We should just keep moving forward.
Danielle, thanks again.
Thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.